So let's take a look at the specific functions of this one is the SL1 camera. So remember, the SL1 camera and the SL2 camera are very, very similar. Really the difference is just that the menu looks a little tiny bit different, and then the top of the camera looks a little tiny bit different as well. So we're going to start using our camera. First thing we need to do is, of course, turn it on. So for this one, if we switch it just to on, it's going to be in photography mode. We need to take it all the way into video mode. And then for this camera, we take it to manual by putting it to the M. And now we are in the video mode itself. So how we can change the settings to start with. So remember, whenever you turn your camera on, there's 4 settings you need to make sure you take care of right from the beginning. Frame rate, shutter speed, aperture or f-stop, and ISO. So let's go ahead and do the frame rate first. So we do that by clicking the menu button right here. That takes us into a menu. And then do know that this is touchscreen. You can touch the screen and actually control this stuff as well. I am going to use the scroll wheel for most of this, just to kind of show you. So when we first go in, most of this stuff is going to deal more with photography. So when we get down to video, here we go. Let me just adjust the focus for you. So the first thing we have that I just want to mention is the grid display. You can turn a grid off or on, and what that does is it puts lines across your screen to help you line everything up. So you can use grid 1 or grid 2. I personally leave it off, but you absolutely can turn a grid on. And then the movie record size, that is important. So we're going to open that up, and we have a couple of different options. So we have 30 frames per second at 1920, 24 frames per second at 1920, and your 1920 is like your 1080, 720. That's 1920. That's a really good recording, has really good quality. And then we have 60 frames per second. We do have this little 640, 30 frames per second. That's to make really tiny files, but it's really bad quality, so don't use that last one. So really your decisions are these 3 here. 30 frames per second is your standard. 24 frames per second is the one where it gives it a more cinematic look because it's actually capturing a little less and you get a little bit more motion blur. 60 frames per second is double time. So it's if you're ever planning on slowing your footage down, or if you want to make sure that everything is just like extra crisp with your action. You might notice that if you are in 60 frames per second, you're only recording at 1200. So the reason is, or 1280, excuse me, the reason is because you're recording now 60 frames per second instead of 30 frames per second, that's double the file size. So it's actually scaling you back a little bit. So you can choose which one you want by going through it. So I am going to keep mine at 30 frames per second, and then you can use your arrows to go back and forth as well. And these are your arrows, so left, right, okay. So I'm going to leave mine right there at 30 frames per second just to make it easy. But there is 1 or 2 other things in here that are worth mentioning. This right here, auto power off. So what this is if you turn your camera on and you don't press record, you don't do anything with it for a while, after 15 minutes, it's automatically going to turn itself off. I've already done this on most of the cameras, but do go in and see what it's at. And you want it to either be at, say, 15 minutes or even completely disable it, because some of them do automatically come with 30 seconds. And why that's really obnoxious, I think, is that when you're kind of playing around with your camera, it just keeps turning itself off. So I like to set mine to a much higher. And then we can go back. So now we are at 30 frames per second. The second thing we need to set after your frames is going to be your shutter speed. And remember, shutter speed should be double your frame rate. Shutter speed is that one right there. So right now it is at 30 shutter speed. We want it to be at double our frame rate, so it should be 60. So how we change that is, of course, you can just touch it and change it that way. Or the other way to change it, which I think is good to remember because this part is going to be the same on any camera, scroll wheel. This scroll wheel right here, you turn it, it's going to change your shutter speed. So now we are double our frame rate at 60. That's perfect. Next one over is your aperture, or how big or small your iris is. So remember, that is going to control both your exposure and it's also going to control your depth of field. So we change that by holding down the AV button and then turning our scroll wheel again. So right now what we're doing is we're going to a much smaller aperture. So the iris is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. So obviously we are really underexposing. And now we're going to go the other way. And okay, so this particular lens only gets to 5.6. Some of the other ones get to 4. So that is as open as that one is going to get. And then the last thing that we need to change is our ISO. So right now the ISO is at 800. So remember, that is how sensitive your camera basically is to light. So you can change that by, of course, clicking on it and adjusting it that way, or if you hit the ISO button. On the top of some cameras, it's a little flash icon, but it's the same thing. Hold that while once again turning your scroll wheel, and that is going to let you adjust your ISO. Remember that the lower the ISO, the better, because these cameras absolutely will film at 16 and 3200. You might be like, yeah, I'm going to just bump my ISO all the way up to make sure that it's properly exposed. But also remember that the higher the ISO, the grainier your image, let me bring that back, the grainier your image is going to be. So you want it to be as low of an ISO as you absolutely can. So right now, if I'm at 400, I'm super underexposed, but the reason I'm underexposed, first of all, I'm just pointed at my desk, so you can't see anything, but also because I'm in my basement. It's kind of dark down here. I have actual studio lights up, you can kind of see it move right there, but it's still quite dark. So your better option, instead of adjusting your ISO, is to actually bring more lights in, to just find a way to actually light it a little bit better, because you can't fix that graininess in post-production. And then a few other little things on here that you want to make sure that you're checking. If you hit the Q menu, it's going to bring up your little quick menu. And I know it's hard to see right now, but this one over here, touch it, that is your white balance. So your AWB stands for auto white balance. And remember, that's it going to figure out, what white is supposed to look like so that your video doesn't turn blue or so that it doesn't turn yellow. But you can also set it daylight, shade, cloudy, and then so on and so forth. This is the one function that I don't mind leaving it on auto because modern cameras do such a good job of just kind of figuring out what this is supposed to look like. But that's another thing that you want to make sure that you're checking, is your white balance. To actually record, we just press that button right there. This button up front, this is for photography. This one back here, this one is for video. So remember, turn it on camera mode. Set it to manual by putting it to M. We check the frame rate by going through menu. We then check the shutter speed by scrolling our wheel, aperture by holding down AV and scrolling the wheel, and ISO by holding down the ISO button and doing the scroll wheel, and then that's it. That is all you have to do. Everything beyond that is just making sure that you're filming things in a way that you think, look good compositionally, and that everything you're filming matches the story you're trying to tell.